everyone, and welcome to the next program at the American Writers Festival. We're focused now on new fiction, including a notable debut, a best-selling author's newest release, and the story of a family schism. Jessica Shattuck is the New York Times best-selling author of The Women in the Castle, The Hazards of Good Breeding, a New York Times notable book, and finalist for the PEN Winship Award and Perfect Life. Yukiko Tominaga was a finalist for the 2020 Flannery O'Connor Award for Short Fiction, selected by Roxane Gay. Her first book, See Loss, See Also Love, was named a most anticipated book by the millions. Donna Hemans is the author of the novels River Woman and Tea by the Sea. Her fiction and nonfiction have appeared in numerous literary magazines, including Slice, Shenandoah, Electric Literature, Miss Magazine, and Crab Orchard Review. They'll be in discussion with Michael Zapata, a founding editor of Make Literary Magazine and the author of the novel The Lost Book of Adana Moreau. Welcome to you all.
Welcome, everybody. What a beautiful thing. I mean, the fact that you came here and it's like 82 degrees outside in Chicago means you love books. And this is a good thing because we have books to love and that you will love here today. So what we'll do is I'm going to go through and we're going to talk about everyone's book. They're very different novels. And what I'm excited to see is how there's some threads that go through each. And so I'll have questions for each individual writer, and I'll have questions for all of them, and we'll just kind of jump in. But I also just want to say thank you for coming to Chicago for this. It's a beautiful day, and one of my favorite things, both as a writer and as a former editor, is to be introduced to new work. So this is absolutely exciting for me to be able to read all of your work, to get excited, to sort of like poke my wife in the shoulder before bed and be like, read this, you know. It's just such a wonderful experience. And so I think when we're going to kind of look at it and through the lens of how do you write a novel, right? How do you write a novel? Whether it's your first, whether it's your second or your third, where's the genesis of that? And I just want to see a show of hands. Y'all are, I'm sure, amazing readers. Do we have any writers? Poetry, nonfiction? I knew it. I knew there would be a lot of writers here. So we'll dig a little bit into some craft talk, not too deeply, but we'll have fun with that. Does that sound like a good plan? I love it. Okay. So I think the act of writing is also like an act of translation, right? Fundamentally, I've been thinking a lot about how a writer is a type of human translator. We translate realities, we translate time periods, historical, we translate place, and we do it for readers who we rarely get to meet and are excited to meet now. So I want you to just share, if you can take a moment and just share how each one of your books sort of like was a process through which you translated an experience, a time period. You know, the books range from Japan to USA to Iran in the 1950s to American suburbs in the 1950s and 60s, geopolitics, the rise and the decline of empire, grief, relationships that are transnational. There's so many things that point in all these books with an act of translation. And so this is very much a global stage. It feels appropriate for Chicago downtown. And I just want to know if you could share with each of us how your novel emerged and how you found yourself in the midst of telling it, of translating the story itself for us. Yeah.
Okay, sure. I'll start. So The House of Plain Truth is a story which is set partly in Jamaica, Cuba, and Brooklyn. And the story really is about a family that is reuniting in some ways. And I started writing this book largely because my grandparents went to Cuba in 1919 and lived in Cuba for about 11 years, then returned to Jamaica in 1931. And so I knew just those basic facts, that they were there, which ones of my uncles and aunts were born in Cuba, but nothing at all about what their experience actually was like. And I think that's a lot of what the experience with migration is for most people, that one of the stories that's always told is that, well, they moved to X country and they did well and they came back, something like that. But not a lot of the pieces of actually the living, what it is that they actually went through, and how difficult that experience was. And so because my grandmother died when I was 16 and my grandfather when I was about 19, I never had that opportunity to ask them what their experience was like. And so I wanted to write this book in some ways to understand what they went through, what the experience was like for not just Jamaicans, but other migrants from the English-speaking Caribbean and from Haiti in Cuba. And it really was a quite eye-opening experience to read, to research all that material and try to put this book together.
Did you have one moment, and of course, writing a book is like an accumulation of 1,000 in one moment. Did you have any particular moment or memory in which going through that research, which of course was a nexus of the personal and the historical, where you might have had sort of an epiphany in finding a way to tell the story?
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
And the big epiphany was that my grandparents went in 1919. And so I wanted to write a book that mirrored those years, 1919 to 1931. And when I started researching, I found out that in 1917, there was a revolution or several revolutions in Cuba, which the migrants got caught up in. And in 1917, there were 17 men, primarily Jamaican, who were all lined up and shot. And once I read that, I knew I had to shift the timeline of the book to include that little tidbit in there because, it was eye-opening for me that something like that happened in 1917, and then my grandparents went in 1919. But I didn't know, what stories did people know when they were making those decisions to go.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
For me, I would say I'm a short story writer who accidentally wrote a novel for the debut. So it wasn't intended to be a novel. In the beginning, I was just chasing after one image that I felt so moving. And then I will build a story around it so that the one image will actually shine in the story. Now it's called chapters. But as I was writing one story or one scene, bits by bits, and then I start to see there is kind of recurring theme. Then I was having so much fun. It was like a puzzle that I am putting together. At the same time, I knew I really did not want to tell in a linear sense because I was dealing with grief. And oftentimes, I used to study therapy and then a hospice volunteer work and stuff. So I remember I was taught that there is a stage in a grief. I can't remember exactly, but there was like a rage or bargaining, and then once you get to acceptance, and then it felt like you overcame this pain. But this is loosely based on my real life, even though it's fiction. But when I actually went through the grief, I noticed it's really not a stage. Sometimes go back and sometimes really go back to different type of emotion, depending on the present, what kind of relationship I have with the present moment. Past changes, memory changes, sometimes feels really positive, sometimes not. And then I felt thinking that I was always like kind of looping and then just processing forever. That I'm not following the steps, that I felt broken. And I don't want anybody to feel that you have a goal to achieve in the grief. And if you don't, you will left feel like something wrong with you. And I think that's why intentionally I just went through loop and loop and loop. And that felt right to call novel.
Yeah, I mean, super profound. And I also think one of the most shocking things I've ever heard as a novelist, I was talking to a poet, and it was along those similar lines, saying, time doesn't work when you fall in love and when you grieve. And it feels the push for chronology. I really loved in your novel where the time was on that loop, and we're not getting everything in a chronology because there is a facsimile, there's a metaphor there of like, how could time work? How could and I think one of the fundamental hard things in any art form, in fiction, is to translate how the heck does time work, right, for your characters, and how does it work when you're grieving? So, wonderful, thank you.
So, is this on? Yes, right? Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you guys all for being here today. It's so fun to be in this city, in this beautiful library, and I'm really impressed, as you were saying, that all of you came out on this beautiful day to come inside, into the basement, no less. But it is a really special library. I love libraries, and I love the way libraries bring people together to talk about books. And in this kind of divided moment we live in, books books are a jumping off point for these conversations we can all get involved with. And thank you for being here to take part in that today. I loved hearing how you guys answer that question. My answer is a little bit connects to yours because my grandparents also factor into the germs of the idea for this book. But I guess there's two ways to answer this. The big picture for this book, which is it's a multi-generational family novel that starts after World War II and begins in kind of the Red Scare of the 1950s, goes up through the next generation in the late 60s, early 70s, and the student protest movement and the splintering off of the radical left. And then ultimately it ends in a sort of alternate present day where the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the original couple are taking refuge in a house in Vermont during a big system-wide blackout. So I kind of came to this directly out of my last book, The Women in the Castle, which was set in World War II and post-World War II Germany. And I spent a lot of time writing that book thinking about what it was like to be German after World War II and how people reckoned with their shame and complicity and what they had been a part of and how they went forward with that and what it was like to be part of a defeated nation. And by the end of the time that I had spent thinking about that, I started really thinking a lot about what it was like to be American after World War II. And in many ways, it was the exact inverse. America came out of World War II smelling like a rose. And I think that generation, that sort of greatest generation, was really the last generation that really cohesively came together around a feeling of American rightness. And there were, not to say that America was always right, but there was this feeling of we were on the right side in that war, and we were the liberators of oppressed peoples. We had vanquished Hitler, and we were now poised to extend a hand to the countries that we had defeated and show magnanimity and spread democracy. And I really was thinking a lot about how that was a really different mindset than where we find ourselves today, I think. And I wanted to kind of write about that journey. And I'm in the unique position of having my German grandparents were part of the inspiration for The Women in the Castle. And this time I have grandparents who fought on both sides of World War II. So this time I looked to my American grandparents. My American grandfather was a veteran. He fought in the Marines in the Pacific. And my grandmother was a college graduate in 1943, graduated and was recruited to be a code breaker for the Navy. So I took both of those pieces and kind of built my characters. Those became the jumping off points for the characters in my book. And the book goes on to as I was thinking about, I'll just add one other element, which is as I was thinking about American life during that time period, the most, I don't know if I want to say important exactly, but certainly a building block of modern life and American life specifically was oil. So that becomes sort of the through line of this book, where I'm thinking about how the characters are interacting with each other, how their relationships change, and how their relationship to oil changes over that time period.
And the novel opens up with a massive list of materials that we live with day to day made from oil. And so it's shocking, and I felt the ghost of Upton Sinclair in there, like and I felt also sort of like in the opening pages too, we have we have this quality with this husband and this wife, and then this wife calls the friend a spy, and they're talking about Iran and all the oil there, and I felt the germination of the modern colonial project was in there. And what was so brilliant about this novel as well is you see it through. Mm-hmm. You see this colonial project through the intimate lives of this family, three generations, and it was just impressive.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I was really interested in the arc of that story and the transformation from the first character, Nick, who is he comes back. He's a veteran of the war, as I said, and he. On the GI Bill, he kind of he rebuilds his life. He goes to law school, and he becomes a lawyer for an oil company. And the first job he sort of has overseas is going to Iran, which is in the early, this is a fairly detailed little piece of history, but in the early 50s, in 1953, the CIA, the American CIA, orchestrated or sort of assisted, it depends on who you read about this, orchestrated a coup to overthrow the first democratically elected leader of Iran. And the oil companies were very much enmeshed with that.
Yeah.
So I've kind of shoehorned this character of Nick into that plot. And part of that was because I thought that beginning of whether it's sort of a colonial project, it's also an oil project, and it was the way that people were thinking at that time versus the way they were thinking even in the 70s, 20 years later, was really interesting, and I wanted to kind of follow that through these families. But it is amazing when I started to think about oil, and you mentioned this list of products made from oil. I mean, it's everything from anything with plastic, as many of you know, it's petroleum, and so it's from dental floss to air conditioning to the gas that fuels our global economies and connects us as a planet. It's really like it's in the marrow of our lives, which is interesting to look at this moment when we're trying to, wean ourselves from it. Like it's deep.
Yeah. In my most existential moments, I read a science article once, and I thought about this when reading your novel. Flash forward a million years, humans were not here. We had a good run. The only thing that might exist in the geological layer as a memory of an intelligent species, bipedal, is going to be a thin layer of plastic. So if aliens come and they start digging around, or if future civilizations, they'll see a thin layer of plastic, which they can deduce chemically would come from oil. So here we are. Okay, so one of the absolute, this as readers and writers, one of the absolute joys of being a reader is connecting on something on a really intimate, personal level. I can't help but read something and get my brain going with how it influences me, both as a writer, both as a teacher. And so I'm gonna ask, I have a very specific question for each one of you that is kind of built off sort of my personal experience reading your novels. But before we do that, if I call on you, would you be willing to share a page or two, just so we could hear your voice and the work, and to compel everybody to go buy their books after this. I taught high school for 10 years. I spent every day selling books to kids. So you're going to want to go get these books for sure. But we would love, if that was okay with y'all, to hear your voice. Yeah. Whoever would like to go first? Should we have Donna? Yeah.
Sure, same
Thank
order.
you, Donna.
Rupert named his children, and now Pearline begins to think that some people refuse to be forgotten. They, these siblings of hers who have lived only in her family's collective memory of a moment on a wharf in Santiago de Cuba, want to be heard. That moment, which marks the last time the living members of her family were together, is stamped in her memory. She replays it now as she has done over the years. Rupert wears his best suit and hat. He's never without his hat. And her mother, Irene, wears a starched white dress, her belly big with the baby she would name Ermina. Pearline is 4 and Eileen 7. Those are the two girls who returned in 1933 to Jamaica. Their oldest sister, Annie, is already a married woman who chooses to stay behind in Cuba. And David and Gerardo, soon to be men, are staying behind too. Irene extracts a promise from Annie to take care of the boys. The goodbyes are loud and long, and the voices like a cacophony of birds, English and Haitian Creole spoken by the people who are leaving, and Spanish from those overseeing the departures. Annie leans over, whispers, "On a clear day, you can see Cuba from there." Pearline believes her, and she and Eileen look out at the blue sea for a glimpse of the distant island, Jamaica. And then they are gone, the last two baby girls in the family, repatriated at the government's expense to an island they had never known. Ermina was nearly born on the ship, but Irene makes it ashore before the baby comes. There isn't room on the ship even for a song. A single whistle maybe, but not a song. Rupert wants no disturbance, no outward sign of displeasure or anxiety or disappointment. A ship's passage paid for by the government isn't the way he wants to return home. He wants to come home like the men who went to Panama, the Colon man with his gold chain and pocket watch. So he finds fault in everything, the waves that rock the boat, the men who report from the deck on the land visible in the distance, the clouds that roll behind, threatening rain, Pearline and Eileen nervous and fidgeting, looking forward. From where they stand, there is no looking back. Even if they could have looked back, Rupert would have ordered them not to. From the moment he stepped onto the ship, he turned his back on Cuba and his children left behind on the wharf, until now, this moment when he calls the forbidden names.
Thank you. So we were able to talk a little bit in the green room about this, and the way I connected to this fundamentally as a reader is my own abuelito, my grandfather, passed away at 103, so really, really blessed life a couple years ago. But in Ecuador, in the Caribbean and in Ecuador, sometimes there's some challenging things to do with what happens to land when an elder passes away, right? And I shared with you in my family, it was a lot of arguing, food, drinking, unknown wills and contracts. And so we have, maybe I have corn somewhere, I don't know. But Pearline, in the novel, she comes back, and you know, you even say performing Jamaicanness, right? You said that in an interview, and I was fascinated with that idea because I really connected closely with the idea of Pearline comes back, and her sisters, they don't want anything to do with it in the beginning, right? There's a determinant with what do we do with our father's land, his memories, and the other children that need to be sought out. What does for you as a novelist, and in writing this novel, what does land and the concept of home mean for you and for Pearline?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. And so yes, in my family there are lots of issues around land and who owns it and who's taking care of it.
We need to find a lawyer.
No, I don't want to have anything to do with it. Too many layers, I do not want to touch that. But I think a lot of it really comes back to when you look at, what happened in Jamaica and throughout the Caribbean, is that, like around 1800, early 1900s, a lot of people who were enslaved were beginning to own land for the first time. And so that's a lot of what you see, one, with my family going off to Cuba, going off to Panama, wherever. People were coming back with money to buy land for the first time, owning something for themselves. And so, once family members start migrating, this land that was finally in the family for the first time begins falling out of their hands. And so it's a question of, like my generation is now becomes, like my grandparents owned something for the first time, were able to pass it on to their children, and now there's my generation that it's probably falling out of our hands. And when I think of it, I think of what that meant to my grandparents to finally own something, and for us to get rid of it or not be able to take care of it really changes a lot about what ownership is. So I think a lot of that is built into this story. It's the history, and it's owning something and having a place that is really truly yours, where like Pearline says it in this book, where you can always come back home and nobody can remove you from it. So it's that kind of a sense, like who owns it and who is responsible for taking care of it. And also, is it really your obligation to carry on somebody else's dream?
I really got a sense too, reading your novel, I kept asking myself, where does generational memory first start when it comes to land, when it comes to home, when it comes to other siblings?
It's a difficult thing.
It's a difficult thing, yeah.
And I think once you add migration into it, it becomes even more difficult.
Yeah.
I grew up in Jamaica. I left Jamaica when I was 16. So I had a relationship with my grandparents' land. My cousins who were born here and who grew up here don't have the same kind of relationship. And if I don't want to have anything to do with the land, I don't want to manage it. I mean, I will take it, I don't want to manage it. But you can certainly see how it becomes even more difficult for once you add migration into it, because you move away, you have your own home, your own family, your own life, and yet you're tied to another country, and you're tied to a land and history, which really should be yours, but in some ways you have stepped away from it, and you're not as tied to it as you could be.
It's ephemeral, beautiful, but strange, and Thank you so much for sharing.
Sure.
Yukiko, I'd love to hear your words.
Okay, so this is the first chapter. The title is Missing, Adjective, Absent, See, Lost. In Japanese, we have no actual translation for I miss you. The direct translation had become extinct, no longer a part of our conversations, existing only in romance novels. The sentence that we substitute was, I'll be lonely without you. But when we say it, we reflectively abandon I and without you, leaving will be lonely. Which of us become lonely because of the other's absence wasn't explicit. We left it to the air to take care of the rest, as if releasing the words was enough to understand one another. These three words floated like bubbles between two people sharing the moment until the bubbles burst and blended into the world. I'll be lonely without you was a mistranslation because missing someone didn't necessarily mean you would be lonely. Missing someone came from the outside, a momentary fact. It was innocent and healthy. Once you moved from the moment, you stopped missing. While loneliness stayed within you like a virus, it mutated, and only distractions allowed us to survive. When I explained this to my mother-in-law, Bobby, she shook her head and said, Japanese people, so specific, yet so vague. At least we make reliable cars, I said. Cars have nothing to do with human emotion. I laughed and told her our conversation should go into the story that I was writing for my class. Do you ever miss me, she asked. Yes, of course. Oh, please, you left Boston for San Francisco after 5 months. You'd rather be alone than have us around to help you. You couldn't stand it here. You can tell me the truth. Then no, I don't miss you, I said. She brought her hand to forehead, her predictably dramatic gesture. I laughed louder, now clapping my hands. We were watching rerun of her favorite mystery show on her bed, eating dark chocolate truffles. It was past 2 in the morning. We'd already gone through 2 boxes in 4 episodes. Will you miss me tomorrow, she asked. Let me think about it. You've had 8 years to answer this question. How much more time do you need? Until you're gone? Are you saying until I'm dead? Yes. How dare you? I'm going to have to teach you how to be polite. No, I would rather stay honest, I said, holding back my smile. Come, give me a hug, she beckoned me, so I put my arms around her and tapped her back. No, that's not a hug. Don't pat me. I'm not your dog. Keep your arm in one place, rest your head on my shoulder, and stay till for 5 minutes. Hug me like you love me. I can't, I said. Why, don't you love me? Not even a little bit? It's not that. I can't hug like you said. How long have you been in this family? All right, I said, and I put my arm around her once more and stay still, my fingers spread on her back. She was wearing a nightgown made of thin cotton, and I could feel her sagging skin between my fingers. She was hugging me just the way I was hugging her. Her hair tickled my cheek, and then I heard the 1920s jazz, a cornet solo coming from the TV. I didn't know if I should close my eyes or where I was supposed to look. There, she said as she moved away. See, I told you, it's not that hard. You know what, I said. We don't have a hug in our language either. No, I miss you, and no hugs. How do you know love? We read the air, I said.
Thank you. I'd rather be honest. And I think with your prose, and I'm sure you get a sense of that, the language itself has this, at times, almost a brutal honesty about grief and about relationships. And of course, this is the mother-in-law of whose son had passed, and also Kyoko. And they form this funny, beautiful, sincere relationship. And so when reading this, I think great joy is seeing so many novelists in the United States today, like there's an expanded sense of story. So you can kind of look at the history. Let's do a quick history of American literature. No. But what it is a story of individualism in the past, a story of overcoming things, a story of the individual sort of against the thing, nature, empire, whatever it might be. But there's this emerging sense, I really fundamentally believe this in what's happening in publishing and literature today, of community and the ways in which we address the way communities are formed, solidarity is formed, love is formed between people through that grief. You do that in such a powerful way. Can you talk just a little bit about the community that you formed in this novel that builds from the mother-in-law and Kyoko and through that grief, but also extends through the lines of San Francisco? And we really end up with this portrait that extends with a pinpoint of grief and love and expands. And I think it's a new way for American literature to really tell communal stories, which felt really comfortable and felt very familiar to me as a Latin American writer and reader. Yeah.
When I have a sense of some kind of a stereotype, let's say in this case a grief, is like a painful, sad. So if someone says, "Oh, I lost my husband," and then immediately people say, "I'm so sorry," and it must be hard. And it's only a partial truth. I think that's what happened. What I wanted to show was that a joy and love that brings after the loss. The loss is just like the beginning of how it starts. But that's not what I wanted to tell. It's how that brings people to you or to others. And in a way, the main character is not really the main character to me. I wanted, in each chapter, she talks to, usually one-on-one with someone else, whether it's her friend or a mother-in-law or mother or son. I wanted them to shine rather than the main character to shine. So that's one thing.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
wonderful. Yeah, and it really blossoms from, and I think true, we have sort of this fictionalized idea of, like you had mentioned before, like what grief can be, but it's through the translation of all we have is language sometimes, right? Like all we have is the language to process how we feel, and sometimes it falters and sometimes it works, and your prose itself is just demonstrably artful in showing us that there are other ways to move through these ideas of love and grief. So it's really profound. Thank you. Thank you. I feel like I could keep talking about all your books. I want to be sure we are aware of everyone's time. So, Jessica.
Okay, I'm going to read, usually I read from the beginning, but since I've already talked a little bit with
Yeah.
you guys about Oil and about Nick and Bet, who are the original generation in the 50s, this is actually the beginning of the second section, which is told from the next generation's point of view, their daughter, Catherine. And this is short. If you Google Harry Taylor, you will find the two photos that appeared again and again in newspapers when he died. The first from the St. Matthew's yearbook when he was a sophomore, and the second a candid snapshot taken 3 years later. The pictures are a perfect yin and yang of youth at the time. They seem to confirm a narrative of dissolution, the hazards of freedom, the dark politics of the era. I think this is why the newspapers loved them. In the first, Harry is a clean-cut 15-year-old in blazer and tie. He's grinning at the camera with a cheerful, open face, a boy you would hire to mow your lawn or walk your dog. In the second, he's hunched over, elbows on knees, shaggy-haired and unkempt, and there's a cigarette or a joint in his hand. He's beautiful, a little androgynous with his wide mouth and high cheekbones. The image itself is darker, the figures in it less defined. Yet somehow, despite the trappings of jaded rebellion, his face still has that unshakable Harry Taylor innocence. There are other people in the background, a big guy leaning against the counter, a skinny guy with glasses, a woman with her feet resting on Harry's chair. If you look closely, you'll recognize the curtains, and above the door, the cuckoo clock Mom and Dad brought back from Austria. It's the kitchen of Last House. Harry is looking at someone outside the camera's frame. He's hopeful, questioning, focused. This was the subject of much conjecture, but I know who he was looking at because I was there. The weekend that picture was taken, we were having a powwow. That's what Huff, the big guy leaning against the counter, called it. He probably even stuck a feather in his hair and whooped with his hand over his mouth. For a lefty radical, he was an ignorant asshole. We were all naive, at best academically aware of our privilege, ignorant of our assumptions. But in our defense, we were sincere. We really believed we could change the world, or at least our own country. America still felt like a malleable construct in those days, a clay sculpture that hadn't yet set. We were eager to blunt the rough edges, hack out the imperfections. But by we, I don't mean Harry. The caption below the image in the Times reads, Harry Taylor and his radical left-wing collective, though none of the people pictured ever thought of themselves as part of a collective. And Harry was never a left-wing radical. He was just my brother and a kid who loved the woods.
Thank you. Narrative disillusionment. It's 2024. So I fundamentally, reading this, I thought you see the fault lines of where we are today, and of course where the book ends, and not too distant future, sort of the fault lines of not only with oil and empire and the legacy of sort of like families and where we can be safe at the end all of things. And so this is something I fundamentally think about, and I think it's a very sort of Chicago question when we're talking about sort of the failures of radicalism, the successes of it, and the narrative of disillusionment. And this is a question I constantly obsess over, and I thought about it multiple times reading your novel. There's a lot lately in the news about the role of art and literature in the fault lines of what's happening in real time online, what's happening in real time on the globe. What can a novel do? This is an easy one. What can a novel do that recorded history can't for you as a novelist?
Well, I guess for me, the thing that I love about writing novels and I love about reading novels is that it is the only art form that I know that actually lets you into a person's thoughts and mind. You can see a beautiful painting and be moved by it. You can hear a beautiful song and be moved by it. But a novel is the only art form I know where you actually co-create the narrative as the reader, and you are in the minds. The writer can take you into the characters' minds and what they're thinking and how their own narratives that they're telling themselves unfold. So I see we're running out of time, so I will leave it at that. But I hope that you all got something out of this, and thank you so much for coming.
Yeah. There's a great, if you're not aware, there's a great, how many of y'all know Studs Terkel? Oh, you got to look him up. Oral historian, very famous Chicagoan who collected oral histories. And I think reading, too, to build off of that, is he did record real history, but he recorded it through interviews of the people he met on the street and the people he interviewed. And until their stories come alive, history is kind of flat. And so being able to see history come alive in all of your work, to see grief sort of like take on this sincere and honest form, it was just a joy to read all of your novels. And for me, I have one bonus round question because we have a room full of writers. Does that sound good? Real quickly, without even thinking, bonus round. What novel or writer made you jump up in the middle of your room in the middle of the night and say, I can do this. I love this. Writer that like made you want to become a writer.
Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God.
Yes.
I'm from Japan, so all the books I recommend is in Japanese and has never been translated. I also work as an editor, so that's my kind of goal, to bring all
we need them.
bring all the writers that cannot be introduced otherwise.
Awesome. Thank you.
I mean, I could say so many different ones, but somehow I just thought of when I was in like 8th grade, I read For Colored Girls Who've Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough. And the poetry of Zhang Ye's writing was like electrifying to me.
Wow.
And it was, I had previously kind of only written poems, and suddenly I was like, and that is a prose poem, but it kind of opened a door for me and was just a beautiful inspiration.
I love it. Thank you all. So, as you know, as readers and writers, it's an accumulation of sentences, stories, and moments to help form the way you think about art, the way you think about literature, the way you write. So, my last thing is going to be to highly, highly recommend. It's my understanding there's a book signing. Yes. And these lovely, brilliant writers will be able to sign books. And I would highly suggest you hightail it up and do that. And again, thank you, everyone. We would say this is a sold-out show. And thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.